Hello. Hi, White Days, people. How's it going? Yeah. Excited. My name is Brian Zabinski. I've been helping performing artists get U.S. work visas for the past 10 years. I'm here to talk about that process and try to make it as simple as possible, even though it is sort of a maze getting through the U.S. government's system. So let's jump right in. The first question to ask yourself is, do you even need a work visa? There are actually lots of situations where, as a performing artist, you could come to the US without a work visa. They are very narrow exceptions. One of the main ones is what they call the showcase exception. If you're performing before an audience that isn't necessarily paying to see you perform, like South by Southwest, for instance, there are lots of music industry conferences that fall within this showcase exception. There are other exceptions as well. One major one is the cultural programs exception. If your home country is sponsoring, 100% sponsoring the event, that could be considered a cultural program. And a lot of times managers, business managers that aren't carrying gear or assisting the artist can come over if you're just signing contracts or shaking hands and coming to watch the artist performance, and not necessarily like working as a tour manager, but more like in a business manager sense. So those are some of the main ones. And in those instances, it's much cheaper and easier. So it's always good to try and explore that avenue first before going through the process to get a work visa. And in those instances, you can just apply for ESTA online. It's just travel authorization. It's the same as a tourist visa. And if you're not eligible for ESTA, say you have a criminal record or some other reason you wouldn't be eligible, you can get a B visa, which is also like a tourist visa. Yeah, do you have a question?
Just real quick, say you get to South by Southwest and you tick these boxes, you don't need a visa, but then you want to get gigs on the side once you're in America. Do you get caught out in that respect, or is there a way you can...
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, yeah, that would be considered unauthorized work. In order to meet the showcase exception fully, you would only be allowed to do your official showcases. You couldn't book gigs outside of the showcases, basically. So that's why it's referred to as the showcase exception, because if you're doing gigs on the side, that wouldn't be covered. And while that wouldn't like hurt you in the immediate to do that, in the future it could. The government notices that you were doing unauthorized work if you go to seek a work visa later on. So it's definitely not advisable to, even though people do it all the time. That's why I always push people to get a work visa, because there are always chances that you come over to do a showcase and then you're offered a gig, or some other event pops up while you're here and you want to perform it. You can't technically do it. So that's the first thing. Once you've decided that, so this just goes further into what we were just talking about. With ESTA or a B visa, you can't do anything else besides within the limited scope of the exceptions. And sometimes even if you do meet an exception, the challenging bit is that you need to convince an immigration officer, like the Customs and Border Patrol officer at the border, how you meet the exception. So you have to convince them. A lot of times, especially with like a big conference, again, the example is South by, they give you like a sheet of paper, just a letter that says these are the rules and please let this person in, and they look at that and they let you in. A lot of border officers know these exceptions, but some are poorly trained and don't know what they're doing. And there is a chance that if you don't have a work visa, you could be denied entry at the border or the port of entry. So, and you hear about that happening like every year, I feel like, in the news. So it's always safer to have a work visa, but it is important to know that with ESTA and the showcase exception, it's an easy way to come in without having to go through the whole process of getting a work visa. So you decide that you don't meet the showcase exception, you need a work visa. What do you do? What work visa do you need? For performing artists and their crew, there's 2 visa classifications. There's all sorts of visa classifications from A to Z and multiple times over. The main ones for performing artists are O visas. They're for individuals of quote-unquote extraordinary ability. And O2s are for their essential support staff. That could be managers, lighting engineers, backing bands. And then for performing bands, that's the P1 visa. You have to prove that the group is quote-unquote internationally recognized. So even just press from outside of your home country would count as being internationally recognized, and that would make you eligible. The P1S is for the crew of the band, and then you also have P3s, which apply for performing artists. They would be what the government considers culturally unique. If you're performing on traditional instruments or wearing a traditional wardrobe or traditional dance, anything that you can point to prove that you're coming to share your culture with U.S. audiences rather than just performing to entertain, that would be considered what they call culturally unique. Yeah, so those are the main visa classifications that you would apply for. Once you've decided, okay, I'm gonna go for this visa, how do you actually go about it? The first step is to file a work visa petition with the USCIS, the Citizenship and Immigration Services Office, on the US side. The government says that you as the applicant can't file the petition yourself. You need someone based in the US to petition for you or sponsor you. Anyone can be your petitioner. It could be an agent, a label manager. It could even be just your friend in the US. It needs to be someone based in the US that can just physically file the paperwork and send it to the government offices. And then once you've decided on who your petitioner is, then you would need to begin gathering documentation for your petition. There's 2 main buckets. The first is your employment evidence, and the other is your what we call eligibility evidence. You need to prove to the government the U.S. government, that you have work. So you need to submit contracts or an itinerary. It's super frustrating because people don't necessarily sign contracts months in advance of needing a work visa. So a lot of times you can get away with a letter or a deal memo, as long as it's signed and it has the correct information on it, at least signed by the artist. That works generally. The eligibility evidence, you need to also prove to the government that you are eligible and you meet the standard for the work visa classification. Like before, for O1s, it's an individual of extraordinary ability. You've reached a high level in your career. For P1s, it's internationally recognized, so you have to prove that you have recognition outside of your home country. They outline that you can either submit evidence of a major award that you've won, or meeting 3 out of 6 eligibility criteria. Multiple items within that. It can be press, it can be testimonial letters, or evidence that you've performed at festivals or impressive venues. there's a lot that goes into that criteria. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, do you know that for you have recognition to work that you've worked outside the UK? Hello, yes. You know how you say like you have to have proof that you've worked kind of outside of the UK? Is that could you get away with if you worked in Scotland but then you did work in England or Northern Ireland, or
Yeah.
is it you can get away with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah, and you don't even necessarily need to work outside of your home country, just proving that you have recognition outside of your home country. So if, a press publication in England published something about your artist or your group, that would work as international recognition. If you only have toured in your home country and you only have press from your home country, it's less likely that you would meet the standard for the eligibility for the P visa. But, there's ways that you can sort of get around it if you have impressive people that you know from outside of your home country to write letters for you, stuff like that. Or if you're working with an impressive record label that's outside of your home country, they could, vouch for you. There's ways to get around it, but I think a surefire way to know if you're eligible is, if you have worked outside of your home country or toured outside of your home country. So once you've got all your documentation, another question.
For the petitioner, if I was, say, like a tour manager, could I use one of my friends in the US as my petitioner and the same friend for all the crew, or does it need to be someone who knows them personally?
Yeah,
Okay.
totally. They just need to be a U.S. citizen or a U.S. entity. It really doesn't, it could be your uncle. It doesn't have to be anyone that's really connected to the application. It's just in terms of actually filing the physical paperwork, they need to be able to send it to the U.S. government offices. It's frustrating because a lot of artists that are trying to break into the U.S. don't have a lot of connections in the U.S. So how do you find a petitioner? It's one of the many hurdles that you need to jump over. So after you've gathered your documentation and filed it, there are some issues sometimes that you'll run into. The government either thinks that you've messed something up, or they don't believe, based on the evidence you submitted, that the artist or the petition that you submitted meets the eligibility criteria. So they don't automatically deny the petition if that happens. They'll issue what's called a request for evidence, so you can try and remedy whatever they found wrong with the petition or whatever they believe is insufficient. It gives you a second chance to meet the standards. And then if you respond and it's still not sufficient, then they'll deny the petition. It usually doesn't get to that point, but it is important to know that you do have a second chance after filing your paperwork to try and remedy the situation and get the petition approved. Once the petition's approved, on the US side, they'll issue an approval notice, and then the artist abroad needs to take a copy of that approval notice and schedule and attend an interview at their local US embassy. That's when they will process the passport. And they do a background check, and then they print the visa into the passport, and then they'll send it back to you. You need to complete a long and arduous DS-160 form, as they call it. And the page, you have to use Safari. It's a really old website, and it always crashes. It's super frustrating. But once you get through that, you pay the fee and schedule the interview. The interview is usually fairly quick and painless. It's 5 minutes or less. They just want to put a face to the name, and they will, like I said, do a background check and then print the visa into the passport and send it back to you. Yeah, another question?
Yeah, we'll come on to the US visa cost increase proposals in a minute.
Oh, yeah.
A couple of questions. I work for UK government, so I've got a little bit of knowledge on this. Is there a restriction on the number of crew that artists can take into the US in terms of, a cap on the visas. And I know that in terms of, if you're an orchestra, for example, again, other limits in terms of the number of people and the supporting staff that you can actually take over for a tour to the States?
Yeah, great question. Currently no, there's no limits. If you need 3 tour managers and you need 3 assistant tour managers and you need half a dozen technical staff, yeah, there's no limit to that. It is important to note that there is a $190 fee per person paid directly to the embassy. So I guess that is another thing to consider. How many tour managers do you actually need on tour, because it starts to get really expensive when you keep adding people. No limit currently. You did allude to the U.S. government currently, or they just announced that they wanted to raise prices, limit how many crew you can have per petition. None of that has passed yet. The period where you could submit a comment has passed, and it's very likely that it will be challenged in the U.S. court system. The last time that the U.S. government tried to raise prices and make significant changes to the visa process, it was also challenged in the courts, and it was never approved. So there is a good chance, because their current proposals are legally problematic, so there is a good chance that these current proposals of the fee hikes and the other changes, like limiting how many people you can put on a petition, will be challenged in the courts. So we'll see how it plays out, hopefully, fingers crossed. But yeah, as it stands, there's no limit on how many people you can put on a petition, as many as you need.
Just say the UK music sector is running a campaign, so Music Managers Forum is here, and they're working with other UK partners to campaign against it. And I know that, talking to your organisation and others, partners in the US who can bring influence to the US government as well. And I know that people like Musicians Union and others, other music organisations in the UK replied to the public consultation.
Yeah, I think I would have allotted a lot more time to talk about this if the public comment period was still ongoing, but since it's ended, there's not much that anyone in this room can do, unfortunately. I think it's always important to advocate for, the right thing for the government to do. But currently the comment period's over. There's not much we can do except for wait until they actually announce the changes will go into effect by X date. And then once that announcement comes, it's highly likely that it'll be challenged legally in the courts, and then it'll be drawn out, and then hopefully, it'll be striked down. But as of right now, we're sort of in a holding pattern for those changes. In the back, yeah.
You said something about the background check.
Yeah.
So does that that include? I'm assuming that includes a criminal records, because I know a few artists that, not necessarily wanting to go to the US, but who have had a pretty rough upbringing. Yeah. So they have a criminal records, but despite all that, they've managed to pull through it and make something of themselves. So does that?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Is it as simple as if you have anything, then you can't get in, or?
No, I mean, it just makes it more challenging and longer process, basically. They consider there's a legal phrase called what they consider crimes of moral turpitude. If you've done something significantly bad, then there is a good chance that you will not get a visa. But if you have a parking ticket, or if you have a very old drug violation, you would still be considered ineligible, but you can request a waiver of your ineligibility, and then it gets kicked up another level. So instead of the embassy deciding if you request a waiver of your ineligibility, it gets kicked over to the Department of State back on the US side. And then those waivers sometimes take anywhere from like a month to like 6 months to process. So you can still get a visa if you have a criminal record. It just might take longer and it might be more drawn out. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of planning for getting the proper visa to come over and work. I'm gonna fly through the rest of this and just save questions till the end because I'm running out of time. But once you've gotten the visa, it's been printed in your passport and sent back to you, then the last step is actually physically entering the US. By this point, once you have the visa, it's 99.9% you're fine, you'll get in. But it's still up to you being inspected by a customs officer at the border or port of entry. One main thing to understand is that the border officers do this all day, and sometimes they fat finger the keyboard and they mess up your admittance. So what controls your amount of time that you can stay in the US is not actually what's printed on the visa. It's called an I-94 travel record that the customs officers update once you enter. You can check your travel record online after you are admitted to make sure that what they entered on their computer system matches what's printed on your visa. Majority of the time they get it right, but definitely run into issues where they make a typo. So once you're admitted, that's basically the last thing you really should make sure that you do is check your travel record online to make sure it matches. So reversing back to the beginning, how much time should you allot for this whole process? For the petition, the US government outlines 2 processing rates, regular and premium. Regular is significantly cheaper, but doesn't guarantee a response time, and they can legally take as long as they want to review the application. So you want to have your ducks in a row far in advance for regular processing. My firm currently sees approvals around 5 to 8 weeks, but sometimes it's quicker, sometimes it takes significantly longer. If you want to avoid paying for premium processing, which is significantly more expensive, you should try and get everything together at least 3 to 4 months in advance of the entry date that you're aiming for. With premium, it's much quicker, but it costs $2,500 compared to $460 for regular. Premium does guarantee a response in 15 calendar days or less. So in terms of needing a visa very quickly, sometimes you may opt for paying for the premium fee. Another thing to keep in mind with the different visa classifications, the O visa can be valid for up to 3 years, whereas the P visa can only be valid for up to 1 year max. And you're not really guaranteed that amount of time. They just say that's how long it can be valid for. They'll approve a visa duration for a week or the max based on whatever employment evidence you submit in the petition. Some countries, the US has poorer relationships than others, and there's a legal term called reciprocity. For the UK, it's a multiple entry visa. For Scotland, for most of Europe, you can enter multiple times with the same visa. Some countries, you are allowed to enter and then stay as long as it's valid, but once you leave, you need to get a new visa before you can come back in, even if your petition's been approved for a longer duration. But you wouldn't need to worry about that with most countries. But it is good to know that most are multiple entry visas. You can go in and out multiple times. Something that I don't know a whole lot about, but it's important to know about, is taxes. So the IRS will basically take a chunk of your money unless you file a withholding agreement with the government. Lots of venues and promoters may not necessarily alert you to this, but they will hold a chunk of your guarantee to account for taxes, and sometimes that 30% will be a huge chunk in order to make the tour viable. So if you want to know more about taxes, there's a really good website called artistsfromabroad.org. I look at this myself sometimes, just it's got so much information on it for free. It outlines a whole section of the website is about the visa process, and then the other section of the website is about taxes on foreign artist pay. So, and it outlines what you need to do to get a social security number, and it outlines basically everything I talked about in much greater detail. And just a shout out to the organization that I volunteer for and that brought me here today, Tamizdat. Tamizdat has a pro bono legal service. If you've already filed a petition and you run into issues, they will help you free of charge to try and fix whatever the issue is. They will not help you if you haven't filed a petition yet, but if you file a petition and then you get an RFE, or there's issues with the petition in some way, they will help you out free of charge. Yeah, that's my whole presentation. I have a few more minutes if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, yeah.
Quick question and observation. Recently, I was at Heathrow Airport, stuck without an ESTA, and I got it approved in 32 minutes. Panicking on a personal hotspot, but
Yeah.
It's just useful to know that's the current timeline. Question is, I've been asked to put forward bands for Canada Music Week. So if bands went to Canada, assuming they did all the paperwork, do these same rules apply when you go from Canada to America and back again? So if a Scottish band was to play in Toronto and then pick up a gig in New York, they'd still need to go through all this paperwork?
Yeah. Canada has its own rules that don't conform with the U.S. rules. So Canada's much easier to be able to work there. It's sort of like the ESTA process for that I explained earlier. You just apply online and then you can go and work. They just want to see, from what I understand, they just want to see what you're working, where you're working and how much money you're earning. And that's it. Whereas the US government, you have to go through this whole petitioning process and then an interview at an embassy. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no workaround. The US government's not gonna be like, oh, you got a show in Canada, come on in. Yeah, you still need to go through the whole process if you wanted to add a US date on your Canadian tour. Unfortunately. One thing to note is that Canada is very strict about DUIs. So going back to the criminal record question, if you do get a work visa for the US and you're approved for the US and you show up at the border to go into Canada to do a couple shows in Canada, they will not let you in if you have a DUI yet. They're very strict about that. I don't know a whole lot about Canadian immigration policy. I just focus on the U.S., but yeah, it's much easier to get into Canada than the U.S. So maybe do a Canadian tour first if you're a band and you need to prove you're internationally renowned. But yeah, that's it. More questions? Yeah, go for it. Sure.
So it was actually just to add on, so Kate Dean's Creative Scotland, just want to say Tamizdat is an excellent service.
Thank you.
And it's
Thank
really
you.
great to have you available for incoming into the US. And you guys are part of the On the Move Mobility Info Point Network, which Arts
true.
Info Point are also members of in the UK. So we have around 11 mobility info points for various different countries, mostly in Europe. But it's fantastic to have one in the US where it is more challenging in terms of the visa processes and things. So I just wanted to say thank you and highlight that kind of wider network there.
Thank you. Thank you for shouting that out.
An observation or two. I've gone through this for 30 years on and off as a manager and tour manager, and I just, for those in the room who want to go to America, think very carefully about why you want to go to America.
Yeah.
If you find it so hard to make a business case for it, it's insane. I've got not a whole lot of patience for the chat about how expensive visas are. They're not that expensive when you break it down, or they can not be very expensive per person over the course of, say, an old visa over the course of 3 years. But what is expensive is flights and accommodation and the gas for your vehicle and the food and the fact that Live Nation and AAG take 15% of your merch money. So just think about very carefully why you're motivated to go to this colossal country and pour all your money into it and get probably nothing back except for maybe a lot of like very lovely, very important cultural and personal experiences.
True. Thanks, everybody.